Should I start without a path? All right. Um, so good afternoon to everyone, to all the attendees present here. I am Barkha Divedi, a fourth year student at Dr. Ram Manohar Lohia National Law University, Lucknow. I welcome you all to today's live panel discussion on internet policies in India and its impact on innovation. Um, Before I quickly introduce everyone present on the screen here, I would like to make mention of our chief patron for today's program, Professor Subir K. Bhatnagar, Vice Chancellor, Dr. Ram Manohar Lohia National University. For Sir has always been encouraging and has been playing a vital role in all the intellectual endeavors undertaken by this university. I would now welcome the Program Director, Dr. Manish Singh, Associate Professor, and Program Coordinator, Dr. Vikas Bhati, Assistant Professor, RML NLU. Both the faculties have been involved, unconditionally involved for weeks for providing students with enriching sessions, be it via webinars or live panel discussions. I welcome you, sir. Today, we are fortunate to have a distinguished panelist with us. All the panelists are proudly affiliated with a well known organization called Internet Freedom Foundation. The organization basically works on variety of issues, be it free expressions, privacy, innovations, net neutrality, etc. I will quickly introduce all the panelists today who are present here with us. Apar would be joining us in a minute. Apar is actually a lawyer and executive director at IFF, Internet Freedom Foundation. For almost half a decade, he has been extensively working on public interest issues. He has been a part of key constitutional challenge to Section 66A of IT Act and right to privacy and Aadhaar, representing public interest litigants. Then we have Devdatta Mukhopadhyay with us. She's an associate counsel at IFF and has been representing cases related to internet shutdown, press freedom, website blocking, etc., before Supreme Court and various high courts. Lastly, we have with us Anushka Jain. She's a lawyer and a policy researcher interested in disruptive technologies like artificial intelligence, and she's also Transparency and Right to Information Fellow at IFF. So undoubtedly, all of these India's advocate on digital rights deserves more introduction. However, all of the attendees are, I'm sure, eagerly looking forward for the discussion. So I would quickly hand over to Dr. Manish Singh for opening remarks, and then I think we can proceed for the discussion.
Okay. Thank you, Barkha. And good afternoon, everyone. I welcome all in one who has joined us to attend this online live panel discussion on a very contemporary and relevant topic titled Internet Policy in India and its Impact on Innovations, organized under the aegis of the Legal Aid Committee of Dr. Ram Manohar Lohia, National Law University at Lucknow. Friends, we all have our experiences of how the proliferation of digital technology and internet has revolutionized the traditional methods of communicating, storing, sharing, and transferring data and information, and also transacting various businesses. Since the emergence of internet, much of our lives have changed. And as internet, unlike the physical world, knows no boundaries, various issues of both national and international significance have to be calibrated to meet the significance, the challenges of its regulation or deregulation that poses. Now, since the emergence of internet, intense debate has been going on around net neutrality, and both the proponents and opponents have fiercely debated the pros and cons of net neutrality and its probable effects on innovation, freedom of speech, competition, among other things. Also, some recent developments on our home turf has also ignited the debate regarding the state's power to regulate internet services by shutting it down for the purposes of law and order. And voices were raised for freedom against this act of the state. We understood that due to this lockdown, various students, scholars, they could not get the opportunity to further their academic endeavors. We must remember that freedom without security would lead to chaos. While some may argue that security without freedom would lead to tyranny. So we have to find a proper check and balance between these two uh, pole apart, we can say, the concepts. And we have to harmonize the both situations to achieve a creative adaptation of innovations and technological developments. Today's panelists who have worked at the very ground level to address these issues, it's my understanding that they would be taking up these issues and throw some light on their understanding. The various issues that when we talk of internet, net neutrality, then we talk of what are the stakes of the public in general and these service providers, whether it will enhance the competition, it will give us better services, or it may have a deterrent effect. So these all issues which touch the general public, like I remember that a few days back there was a call made by a very renowned person to ban the Chinese apps. Now, whether this banning of Chinese apps, though it may have a patriotic lineage, but whether in effect it will do some good to Indian business, because to my understanding, many of these services provided by the apps, they they uh, they belong to the Indian startups, and in this international scenario, most of the angel investors were Chinese. So, to whom do you want to harm? To the Chinese angel investors or to the Indian startups? So, that is something I think the panelists must ponder on and give some, their thoughts, their take on that. So, with these remarks, I welcome all the panelists, the distinguished panelists, and I sincerely hope that we'll be enriched by their understanding, by their research, what they have so far learned from their research. Kindly, percolate down to all the attendees of this panel discussion. I invite Apar Gupta to hold the mic, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Manish, for this generous context setting. And just to get directly into this, I would encourage all participants to continuously put in questions, which will be taken towards the end. We'll be making short remarks, and just to explain the structure, me and my colleagues will be taking 5 minutes each for introductory remarks, after which we'll be also getting into issues in a little much more detail. So we will first rotate for 5 minutes amongst ourselves. That will be first me, then Anushka, then Devdata. And thereafter, we will be doing another round of another 5 minutes each. After which we'll be going towards your question and answers, which is why it's important to support the interactivity, which is the core component of this webinar, of addressing what are things in your mind when you look at how digital technologies are interacting with fundamental rights. Those questions which you have, which come to your mind when you read about news reports of data breaches or of calls to boycott applications which may be created in China or from Chinese corporations, as was just stated by Dr. Manish. How would you like to proceed ahead with it? So firstly, let's just do some context setting. What is the Internet Freedom Foundation? The Internet Freedom Foundation by itself is a advocacy non-profit which is centered in New Delhi. It also has trustees in Bangalore, and it has technologists and lawyers. We work towards ensuring that fundamental rights are protected with the advance of technology. And what are those fundamental rights? One of the first ones which you know about is the right to privacy, and some of my colleagues will talk about it a little more. But first, I would like to talk to you a little much more about where did we start? We started with the net neutrality campaign, if you remember. And the net neutrality campaign essentially meant that everyone should be able to access the internet without your internet service provider slowing up or increasing the speed or changing your user experience whenever you visit a specific website. So let's just imagine that a shopping website for the purposes of illustration, such as Amazon, loads faster than Flipkart. You will only visit Amazon. You won't visit Flipkart because the experience is not good. And the internet service provider, for providing that faster service, charges Amazon more at the back end. There may be also a circumstance in which you purchase an internet pack, and while you're not charged anything extra beyond what you pay at the end of every month to access websites, you pay a little bit more whenever you visit websites more than those 200 websites which you're permitted to, just like a cable television network. So this was a regulatory issue which was brought up in 2015, and this was addressed by the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India after a large campaign was run by a number of volunteers who came forward and created an online campaign called Save the Internet. You may remember certain AIB videos around it, which is one thing which a lot of people remember. But you would also remember that this was a regulatory basis of intervention by the telecom regulator based on reading of the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India Act and the rulemaking powers under it, where they published a regulation called the Prohibition of Discriminatory Tariffs, okay, thereby prohibiting zero rating plans, which would give free access by itself, such as Facebook Zero, which was aimed towards providing 20 to 30 websites for free, okay? Or on the flip side by itself, where your ISP could moderate your user experience. This not only has an impact on you as a user, but also had an impact on innovation, because the smaller companies and the websites or the individual blogs or your own special places of the internet where you're building your own startup would nowhere be able to have these commercial arrangements with a large telecommunications provider such as Reliance Jio or Airtel or Vodafone or Idea, and negotiate that your website runs on the same speed as Amazon or a Flipkart, right? So if you start a small store, it just sells homemade candles, for instance, you would not be able to compete with them, which is why innovation was the very basis of the network neutrality movement and the intervention in that case. Another issue which came in was that do we need to license any kind of internet websites prior to them being launched? And here it becomes really, really important for us to also focus on what may be necessary and how we may take this path forward, okay? And it becomes very, very important here to also sense that when you license an internet service by itself, you also require a high degree of compliances in the very, very beginning by itself. Now, this kind of innovation impact would be there for entrepreneurs who today can just create a website of their product and services, and beyond specific regulatory requirements which arise, let's say, from the payments industry, or which arise from the food packaging industry, or the specific sectoral regulations which arise, generally to get your business online by itself is not a problem. To start a new service is not a problem. You do need to register with certain laws. You do need to take down content which you're notified is illegal. But beyond that, not really a lot, right? So how do we deal with this? We deal with this through specific evidence-based policy making, which is on the basis of economic study, arguments of fundamental rights, and also the innovation side impacts in terms of the product and service offerings which are able to be availed by ordinary Indians like all of you, right? Now, let's go a little bit further. What is the Internet Freedom Foundation doing today? And for this, I will be stepping towards my colleagues now, who will provide broader and a richer context, especially drawing on their work. That includes Anushka and Devdatta. So first, I would like to just call on to Anushka. Anushka, if you can unmute yourself for a minute.
Yeah.
Hi,
Hi.
Anushka. So let's
Hi.
wave hi to all the people here.
Hi, guys.
So Anushka actually does and conducts a lot of our work on transparency around policy making processes. And you may have seen her recent posts with regard to, let's say, what is the most, which post actually, Anushka, you would like to talk about itself, which is there on our website to give a context of the kind of work that you do?
Yeah. I was today, I thought about how I should, structure this talk. So I thought that I will talk about the recent post that I did on Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Now, firstly, as Dr. Singh mentioned, that we have been seeing that, internet shutdowns have been happening and other things have been happening. So one of the most basic questions that comes to anybody's mind is, do you have a right to internet? Do you have a right to access the internet? So in that context, you can talk. I would like to talk about the judgment of Anuradha Bhasin versus Union of India, which can also be said to be the Kashmir shutdowns judgment, in which IFF has been involved. In that judgment, it was said that while internet is not access to internet is not a fundamental right, internet is a medium to exercise fundamental rights. So in this situation, they're talking about the fundamental rights given to us under Article 19, which talks about online speech, and 19(1)(g), which talks about online business activities. So the judgment said that indefinite suspension of internet is illegal, and that shutdown orders must satisfy tests of necessity and proportionality. What this essentially means that the government has a negative obligation to not shut down the internet. So that much we understand, that the government has a negative obligation to not restrict internet. But the question that next arises: does the government have a positive obligation to provide internet to its citizens? In this context, I would like to talk about the recent post that I did on Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So, the problem with Andaman and Nicobar Islands is they only have connectivity through satellite, and the internet access that they have right now is abysmal. To be very frank, they have 2G speeds, and they cannot watch YouTube videos, especially. Right now, they cannot do video conferencing, they cannot do online classes as most of us have been doing. So in that context, I would like to talk about whether the government has a positive obligation to provide access to internet at a fast speed and at reasonable prices. Because what is happening is in Andaman is that one person, if I give an example, received a bill of rupees 50,000 for his internet, and that internet also is not fast, it's 2G speed. So just imagine paying 50,000 for bad internet. But that is what is happening in Andaman. So with regard to positive obligation to provide internet, we can talk about the National Digital Communications Policy of 2018, which has a mission to create a robust digital infrastructure. Now, what they want is what they said that they would provide is broadband for all. What they mean by this is what this signifies is that they understand that internet is important, and in the policy itself that they recognize that the transformative power of digital communications, and they also acknowledge that digital empowerment is necessary so that innovation can be done through the internet, which I think is the most relevant part of the talk that we're having here today. So that is what I wanted to say introductorily about the right to internet, which I think is a topic that should be addressed firsthand in this conversation. Apar, you can step in now.
So, Anushka, thank you so much for that background. There's another thing which we have been working on called Actively, which is facial recognition. Would you like to also tell a bit about people about how facial recognition deployment is happening and why IFF is doing a lot of that kind of work? It will help people also gain a broader sense of the aspects around discrimination, especially given that a lot of people are looking at it.
So with regard to facial recognition, if most people must have noticed that we have been noticing that facial recognition has come to the forefront of technologies that the government has started deploying. There is currently a tender out for the National Automated Facial Recognition System by the National Crime Records Bureau, which is under the Ministry of Home Affairs. So what they're trying to do with that tender is they're trying to create a database wherein they will store they're trying to create a database of photographs wherein they will connect it to other criminal databases and then create like a whole profile of a person. Now this is extremely problematic on in two ways. Firstly, if they have a facial recognition system which is incorrect. So imagine what happens is using the facial recognition system, they recognize me as someone that I am not. In a situation where it is being used by the police, I could be recognized as a criminal, which would obviously lead to me being, me being arrested. It could lead to me going to jail, which is a problem. In the other situation, what could happen is that they could fail to recognize me as myself. This is also happening wherein we're saying that facial recognition is being used to provide access to government schemes like Aadhaar. So in this situation, if I am not recognized as myself, I would lose out the benefits that the Aadhaar scheme provides me. So that is one situation wherein facial recognition becomes problematic, but the government is, going ahead with this problem, with this technology. Now, the obvious solution to this is that you create a facial recognition system which is 100% accurate, so that you don't face these problems of misidentification. First of all, I would like to say that facial recognition 100% has not been developed, 100% accuracy has not been developed anywhere in the world right now. So assuming that we will be able to develop it in India is a misnomer, wherein because it has not been done anywhere else in the world. Also, even if we take the assumption wherein we say that 100% accurate facial recognition is going to be adopted by India, that also becomes problematic because then it could lead to a function creep. What I mean by function creep is the government could say that they're using facial recognition technology to find missing children. That is the judge. There is a judgment in the Delhi High Court in Sadan Haldar versus NCT of Delhi, if I'm not wrong, which says that the court says to the government that you can use facial recognition to find missing children. But now what is happening is the Delhi police is using facial recognition to identify protesters during which happened protesters who participated in the protest which happened in December 2019. So this kind of function creep would lead to problems because what can happen is at the back end, by using facial recognition, they can create whole profiles of people, wherein this could lead to uh, um, problems because they can then create a profile wherein they will try to stop dissenters, and this could actually come back to the problem wherein our fundamental rights can be hampered. So facial recognition is one of the main topics which I work on, and the work that we do, especially I do, is through the Right to Information Act, wherein I file right to information requests to get information from the government, because the use of this technology is being done in secrecy and we don't really know how the government is doing this. And if we don't have transparency with regard to how they are going to develop and deploy this technology, we will not be able to ask for accountability from the government. So that is one of the major areas in which I work. Apar? Apar, you can step in now.
Sorry, I always forget to unmute myself. So, in a recent lecture, actually, or in a recent address, the CEO of Zoom itself, he started talking, and somebody had to remind him to unmute himself. So, I think that is a very large problem which cannot be addressed by policy. It is only has to be addressed by behavioral change. So, even public policy looks at behavioral change quite often, and what can be much more significant than the behavioral change which is provided to us by the high degree of privacy through encryption technologies? For instance, our WhatsApp conversations are end-to-end protected. But also, there are certain times that encryption technology poses a challenge in which a lot of governments look towards acquiring greater sense of control over our information, and they say that the encryption is a black box. And sometimes we've also seen, just going back to Dr. Manish's question, that certain apps are causing a kind of behavioral change which is not suited for society. So should we ban those apps? For instance, a popular gaming app such as PUBG, which was banned through prohibitory orders. Here, I would like to invite my colleague Devdatta Mukhopadhyay, who extensively litigates and works with the larger network of litigators. She's worked on the Kashmir telecommunications challenge and the 4G challenge, the encryption challenge, also in the Madras High Court. But today, I would first ask her to actually look at some bits of litigation and how they interact with fundamental rights, but also touch upon other areas of Arogya Setu, of medical healthcare data. I'll give it up to her because she is the expert here, and I am, in fact, interested in learning and taking notes when she talks.
Thanks, Apar, for that very kind and generous introduction. Hi, everyone. So my name is Devdatta, and as Apar mentioned, I largely do litigation work at IFF. So what I'm going to be sharing with you today are primarily my insights from working in courts on digital rights issues, and also how I see this tying into the broader legal and regulatory ecosystem that's present. So as we all know, technology in India is changing at a very rapid pace, but unfortunately, our laws are unable to keep up with it. So for instance, we still order internet shutdowns under the Telegraph Act, which was enacted in 1885. And we don't have any kind of a data protection law in place even in 2020. And this is also, I believe, a systemic problem with lawmaking and law reform in India generally. But what it leads to is that a lot of highly technical and complex issues, which should ideally be addressed in a consultative and deliberative manner by the parliament and the executive, ends up becoming the subject of litigation before courts. And courts simply do not have the right kind of framework or approach to be able to deal with these kind of issues. And this also completely upends the normal process of law and policy making and creates a very unpredictable and risky environment for private companies, which of course stifles innovation. So let me try and explain this with the help of an example. In December of 2018, the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology proposed amending India's intermediary liability framework. Two main changes that were proposed was first, that all intermediaries would be required to deploy automated filtering technologies for illegal content on their platform. And yes, the requirement was just this vague. It did not clarify what categories of illegal content needed to be filtered, what kind of automated technology needed to be deployed. There was a lot of ambiguity. The other requirement was that all intermediaries should help law enforcement agencies identify originators of information on their platform. Now, what does this mean? If you receive a WhatsApp forward, these days you will see that there is a tag attached at the top saying forwarded. But there is no way for you to know who is the person that originally wrote and sent that message, which has now been forwarded in the chain of communication multiple times. And that's because the protocol for encryption that WhatsApp follows, which is also the Signal protocol, um, is built in such a way that forward secrecy is a part of it by design. And the whole communication line is end-to-end encrypted. What does this mean? This means that if I send you a message on WhatsApp, even WhatsApp cannot read that message. Because to decrypt that message, a key is required, which is only available with the intended recipient of the message. Now, this is obviously creating some problems for law enforcement agencies, because law enforcement agencies say if an illegal message goes viral, which maybe incites people or contains content which is abusive or harassing towards certain people, then there is no way for law enforcement agencies to figure out who is the person that originally shared the content. However, at this stage, I would like to point out that while WhatsApp does not give the content of the actual message to law enforcement agencies because it doesn't have access to it, it does collect a lot of metadata about our communications. So, for instance, WhatsApp will know that I messaged XYZ person at so and so time, this was the file size, etc. And when you have access to that kind of metadata, it is easy to sort of build profiles of people's social networks and figure out what are their activities. So at this stage, I'd just like to point out that law enforcement agencies do have access to, a fair amount of metadata, which allows them to proceed with their investigation. So now, when these proposed amendments were first released for public consultation, there was a lot of criticism from civil society actors because there were fears of overbroad censorship by these automated filters who don't really understand the context in which a word is used. So, for instance, a word like terrorism could be used to even condemn terrorism. But automated filters obviously don't understand the context in which the term has been used, and therefore they could lead to censorship of even legitimate content. The other fear was that this traceability requirement, which was intended to figure out who is the originator of a message, could end up undermining end-to-end encryption. I think the best sort of defense of encryption that I have heard has come from Professor Manoj Prabhakaran from IIT Bombay, who gave a talk last year with one of our IFF events, and where he described encryption in these terms. And this is during the Delhi winter, where there was massive pollution. So he looked at the audience and he said that earlier when people wore masks, you thought that they were a bad person. They were wearing a mask because they were up to no good and they were trying to do something which was illegal. But now, especially during the coronavirus pandemic, I think this metaphor is particularly appropriate. Now, when we see people wear masks, we know they're not doing it to, sort of harm others, but rather to protect themselves. And we need to understand that the digital environment is also a very toxic environment, just like the air we breathe now, which is, filled with potential viruses. Because you have hackers, you have malicious actors, so and people need to protect themselves from these kind of threats that exist. And this is why IFF from the very beginning has been a strong defender of, because we think it is what keeps ordinary internet users safe from both government and private surveillance. And this became a very hot button issue even before courts when the Madras High Court back in 2019 started hearing a public interest litigation which originally sought linkage of Aadhaar with all social media accounts so you could figure out who was the real person posting a particular message or image. But later on, it snowballed as public interest litigations tend to do and became all about traceability and encryption. And obviously, WhatsApp was singled out because WhatsApp was an end-to-end encrypted platform, unlike Facebook or Twitter. When WhatsApp explained to the court that it did not have the technical ability to read its users' messages, the court appointed a professor from IIT Madras who claimed that he had devised a technical method which could fingerprint every single message with the phone number of the originator. At this stage, IFF intervened in the case, and we had reached out to Professor Manoj Prabhakaran, whom I had mentioned earlier from IIT Bombay, who's also an expert in cryptography. And we filed an affidavit by him which explained that this technical method which had been devised for fingerprinting was actually not technically sound and was quite susceptible to spoofing, which meant that anyone with a reasonable amount of technical skill could sort of reverse engineer it and change the details of the originator, which would lead to, unintended targeting and harassment of completely innocent individuals. Now, obviously, you don't expect a high court judge to understand all of this, right? Like, this is highly technical stuff that even IIT professors cannot agree upon. So why are high court judges being forced to decide these kind of issues? And again, as I mentioned, that's because lawmaking and policy making in India is really lagging. We don't have enough regulatory and legal clarity for businesses to thrive. And I think that is something that is missing and that's crucial. I also have some remarks about Arogya Setu because I know that's been in the headlines and everyone knows about that. Apart, do you think I should just continue now, or maybe we should do like a round of questions and then I could come back?
So Dev, Devdatta, since you do have a good sense of momentum, I would urge you to continue on Arogya Setu.
Okay, that's great. So the second thing that I wanted to talk about is basically, actually, before I go to Arogya Setu, let me just go back to what I was initially saying and talk about the kind of destabilizing and risk-enhancing impact that courts really getting involved in these kind of issues has, right? Because try to imagine that you're a private company, you're a private player who's trying to launch some kind of a technological service in India. Now, ordinarily, if you were afraid of some kind of regulatory or government action which could harm your operations, you would have multiple opportunities to contest that. So, say for instance, the government wants to make a law which you don't think goes in your interest or would prevent you from operating in India. There will typically be say draft rules or a draft legislation which is published, be a round of public consultation which will happen. You will also have the chance to maybe do some kind of private lobbying with the relevant bureaucrats and ministers. And then, worst case scenario, say if a terrible law is enacted, which you think is compromising the free speech and privacy of your users, you will have the opportunity to go ahead and then say challenge it before a high court. If the high court doesn't agree with you, you then have an opportunity to go and challenge it before the Supreme Court. So there are multiple safeguards and multiple opportunities for you to raise concerns before that drastic step, you being forced to shut down your business or exit the market happens. Whereas now, as we are seeing, for instance, the Madras High Court case, which I mentioned earlier, which was about traceability, has now been transferred to the Supreme Court. These kind of cases are very high risk propositions for companies. I just wanted to give that sort of an explanation for people who may not be familiar with the digital rights space to fully explain why courts routinely getting involved in these kind of matters is dangerous. Sir earlier mentioned, for instance, that there's a call to ban Chinese apps in India. TikTok, in fact, was banned in India last year by the Madras High Court for about 2 to 3 weeks before that ban was reversed. And during that period, TikTok was not available for new downloads on the Google Play Store or on the Apple Play Store for Indian users. So, I mean, courts have a very, very significant impact in the digital rights and tech policy sphere. So, sort of now having explained that, I'll move on to the second thing I wanted to talk about, which is I believe that a major barrier to innovation in India is that a lot of major technology projects by the government are being co-opted by select private sector players. So what do I mean by this? Let me give you an example. Now, all of us know the Arogya Setu app, which was launched by the Indian government for COVID-19 surveillance. The app was initially launched on the 2nd of April and it was projected as a proximity notification app. It has since been downloaded by over 100 million Indians and its scope has really expanded. So it's no longer now just about, notifying people if they've been in the proximity of a COVID positive person. It's also been integrated with e-pass facilities and telemedicine. Now, why is this relevant? This is relevant because you have to understand that right now, telemedicine as an industry is going through what digital payment apps like Paytm, etc., went through during demonetization. You have a very, very large number of patients who are using telemedicine services for the first time because they are unable to go to hospitals because one, hospitals are overburdened dealing with COVID cases, and two, it's also not safe to go to a hospital, right? Because they are hotbeds of infection. So now any telemedicine service which is recommended by Arogya Setu has a huge competitive advantage because its customer acquisition costs are very low and it has this ready-made potential user base of 100 million users already. So one of the telemedicine services which is recommended by the Arogya Setu app is called the Swasth Alliance, which is led by executives from established companies like CureFit, Practo, 1mg, etc. Now, smaller telemedicine companies in conversations with journalists have anonymously confided that they are feeling a lot of pressure to join this Swasth Alliance and they have been sort of discouraged from independently listing their services on the Arogya Setu portal. Now, why may smaller telemedicine companies be reluctant to join this kind of an alliance? One major reason is that they don't want to share data about their retained doctors with bigger companies because then bigger companies can figure out which doctors are the most profitable and poach them. So these are real concerns about, anti-competitive behavior, which could be facilitated by these kind of alliances which exist. I think it's also very important for us to remember that something like the Arogya Setu app, even though it is collecting sensitive health data and location data of 100 million Indians, is not governed by any kind of a legislative framework. So there is no guarantee that the data which is being collected by this app will not be then shared with private players. And these risks are even heightened because private sector volunteers have been involved in the development of the app from the very start, right from the process of coding, etc. So I think, and as users of these kind of technologies, we should be worried because, for instance, say if private companies have access to your sensitive health data, and please remember that the Arogya Setu app collects data about what symptoms you currently have, what comorbidities you may have. For instance, are you a hypertension patient? Do you have diabetes? Things like that. So if this kind of information that we have given to this app for the limited purpose of knowing if we've come into contact with someone who has COVID or not, is then sold to private companies and used to build profiles of us and make decisions like, oh, how much insurance premium should we charge this person? I think that is a very, very serious violation of our privacy. So, and this is not just limited to Arogya Setu. Private sector interests have also shaped other big government tech projects like Aadhaar. And the bottom line is that this current trend of techno-solutionism that we're seeing, which basically means that you think technology will solve everything because it's the easy answer, right? Launching an app is easy, but things like manual contact tracing through like some 10,000 ASHA workers is much harder to do. So that kind of techno-solutionism, what it ends up doing, I think, is that it reduces customer acquisition and transaction costs for the very select small players who have experience sort of like a gold rush. But then it also weakens the privacy of ordinary users and harms smaller companies. So I think those are just some comments I have on innovation and what's been happening currently in India. Apar, do you have anything to add, or we could maybe even take some questions?
I think given that we only have about 12 to 13 minutes left, it would be just best to take in questions right now, Devdatta. So given that the questions are not visible to me by myself, I would request our host, Mr. Dr. Manish Singh, to kindly relay them to us so we can respond to the participants' comments.
No, we are getting quite a few questions. So I will
please, Manish, if you can direct them directly to Devdatta and Anushka. I've spoken for quite some time, and actually I help the organization, but they do the work. As with most organizations, are practically useless because I sit on top.
Okay, if that's the case. So one question that came from Mr. Anil Sen, who's an assistant professor, faculty of the University of Delhi. So he's asking, will the decision of the court on internet as means to fundamental right still hold in recent times? Can it be read as a fundamental right under right to education? Now, this is a question which is also shared by someone from Kashmir over the messages, and he also shared the same concerns. So, what do you think? Devdatta and Anushka, you can answer.
Hi. So yes, I think oh yeah, sorry, that's much better. I'll let Anushka chip in. I just want to give some preliminary thoughts and comments because these are the kind of arguments that we have also been making before the Supreme Court in the recent plea which seeks restoration of 4G internet services in Jammu and Kashmir. Now, we must remember that students in Jammu and Kashmir have been suffering from prolonged school closures since 5th of August 2019. So while the rest of us in India are dealing with, the last 3 months of the pandemic, they've been dealing with this a lot longer and their education has been seriously disrupted. So we have made arguments before the Supreme Court about how if people are exercising their right to education through the internet, which is, through online tools like WebEx, Zoom, etc., to attend classes, attend webinars, that is something that should be constitutionally protected. And that's because extensive fundamental rights jurisprudence, which acknowledges that it's not just about the right which is protected, but also anything ancillary to the right which you need to meaningfully exercise the right. And we're hopeful that the Supreme Court will consider these arguments and direct restoration of 4G there in the near future. But I think it's important to recognize the difference between this argument and an argument which says that there is a fundamental right to internet access. Because that argument takes it one step further and that imposes a positive obligation upon the government to provide broadband connectivity to every single Indian, which is different from saying you should not shut down internet services because there is a right to access the internet. So this right has two conceptions. The first is a negative conception where the government cannot interfere with internet access. The other is a positive connotation where the government must facilitate internet access in cases like Andaman and Nicobar that Anushka has mentioned. Anushka, would you like to add something to that?
No, I think they've covered it mostly. So yeah, that is the question. The having internet as a fundamental right would be a little problematic for the government, because then they will have to answer questions such as why are they not providing internet to the people of Andaman or to the people of Kashmir. You understand? So a fundamental right is much harder to take away than like a normal right. So right now in Anuradha Bhasin, it was said that the internet is a medium to access fundamental right. That is the stage we are at right now. And litigation is ongoing with regard to Kashmir, which Dev handles. And I think she has answered the question perfectly. I don't think I have anything else to add. Thanks.
Another question that has came is there any definition for digital market at online platform, and how its relevance will be determined by the relevant authority? Should I repeat it?
Yes, please repeat that again.
So, is there any definition for digital market at online platform, and how
I
it's
don't think so. We'll be well equipped to answer this. We can shift to another question. Yes.
If I may just like point out, there is a definition of intermediaries under the Information Technology Act. And the definition of an intermediary is extremely broad, right? It includes everything from social media platforms to search engines to even cyber cafes to matrimonial websites. But yeah. But there is a definition of intermediaries under the IT Act, which talks about, and that's relevant because that determines who can claim a safe harbor under Section 79 of the IT Act. That's just the only point.
In fact, if I may ask a question, we have a question from Vani Tripathi regarding the app bans like TikTok and PUBG. In fact, I have a similar question. In April 2019, I think, when Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology enforced the stay on the ban of these apps, it was your organization who were concerned that banning such apps could basically emerge as a standard practice, considering the same. And the reason why most of the youth, if I may say so, is concerned about TikTok, because now I may commit a social suicide here by saying that, in fact, TikTok is my guilty pleasure as well. So most of the people do enjoy it. However, if we see that the reasoning that was given by the court, and in fact, I read one of Apar's statement in Economic Times, wherein he said that there are range of harms that may be caused because of apps like TikTok, whether it's harm to adolescent health or privacy breach, etc. However, there are a source of, it is a right to freedom of speech, and it is right. It contains right of entertainment. So my question to you is, and which also has been curtailed out by Vani Tripathi, is how do you draw a line wherein a solution could be a policy restructuring, like you can reconstruct the policy and that could be it, or whether why not just simply ban the app in the interest of society? So what are the parameters wherein you can judge the same? Apar or Devdutt, anyone can take this.
So, if you look at the prohibition which was passed with regard to zero rating, which I did talk about, that does place a regulatory barrier on zero rated services, which are discounted services for internet access for people in India, where they can, through a regular cell phone connection without data access about 10 to 20 websites. But it does is it prevents discounting, but also prevents overcharging. So there is a prohibition there. It is a prohibition which is placed in a regulation which is also accompanied by explanatory memorandum as to what will be the impact if it is permitted. So the first thing is that the restriction which is placed on any kind of technology deployment needs to be evidence-based. Okay, there needs to be a clear reason. And prior to the TRAI taking this step, it organized a large public consultation, which carried on through several specific interventions and conversations over a period of time of about 1.5 years, right? And then it came to this decision. So, is there enough evidence of harm for a step as drastic that you don't regulate it to a degree where you are requiring certain changes or compliances, but you're prohibiting it itself? The second is the prohibition needs to be a time bound prohibition which ties in with the reasoning you have given for the prohibition. So you need to come up with very clear, legally tolerable reasons why somebody's ability to actually innovate, launch this product is impacting others' liberties, fundamental rights, or any kind of regulations and laws which are in the public interest. So that reasoning, which is there in the explanatory memorandum, which is on the basis of public feedback, policy making, and then steps towards what is constitutionally and legally permitted, forms the reasons. And then that reason needs to come with a what is called as a doctrine of proportionality. So the ban cannot be indefinite. It has to be for a period of time, and it needs to be reviewed at a basis in which the restraint is not a total restraint for all perpetuity by itself. So these are important considerations for policymakers when they do look towards those uh, edge cases where bans may be considered, this prohibitions on complete types of activities may be considered, but they may be considered in a way. Another classification may be there may be the creation of a new crime by itself, which may emerge due to the deployment of technologies, right? For instance, we are noticing non-consensual sexual imagery being circulated of former partners, which brings a high degree of shame, social ostracism, and damages that person psychologically and emotionally over a long period of time itself. Thereby, uh, just because it is circulated on the internet, also the field and the field of dissemination, the number of participants who can also receive that information, all of that increases, right? So there may be the creation of a new crime. And in fact, there's a paragraph in Shreya Singh where Justice Nariman says that new technologies may lead to the creation of new offenses by itself. But by itself, we have seen because a pre-existing Indian Penal Code is fairly fungible. It's in a way it can be used agnostic of technology, and also there are large number of provisions under the information technology. This situation has not arisen. So, for instance, one other instance is phishing, where you use the personal information of people and you essentially defraud them or you impersonate them. So those are also crimes. Another consideration is just that such prescriptions for protectionism have severe ecological impacts to a broader innovation which benefit local firms and end users. So we need to look at how can prohibitions also result in the service offering being preventing other local firms who build products which are complementary to it and to users. So there are benefits also to technologies which may not actually be evident. For instance, popular social media, video sharing application, TikTok, for instance, it's promoted so many people who we call influencers. And while we may not individually like the kind of content they put out, it does to a certain degree engage and entertain people. And what's different from it from the times when the television was first launched, which marked a transition from the radio to the television? What is different from the times when the radio was first launched, and it marks a transition from written text to oral communication? And at all those times, there's a huge amount of public panic. So the media engagement by itself builds a larger ecology of value by itself. Okay, so with this, I'd like to end it. I think it's close to our time for closing. So maybe we can just do a summation and a conclusion now. Anushka, Devdatta, do you have any other points you would like to mention on this question or any other?
I just wanted to add that I think this culture of banning apps, right? Like, what are you trying to substitute? Like, if parents are worried that their children are spending too much time playing PUBG, then they need to be enforcing better discipline upon their children. The solution is not the police officer to pass a Section 144 order, which can lead to like 6 months imprisonment and then arrest like a bunch of teenagers for sitting and playing video games with their friends. So I think there is like a very fundamental problem solution mismatch where one, we are very easy to rely on technology, as I mentioned, techno solutionism, and the other is we want to ban things and impose criminal penalties for everything. If you're concerned, for instance, about things like the Blue Whale Challenge, we should maybe be making sure that there are better mental health services available for students in schools and universities. Because these things are the symptom, they are not the problem. The problem is much deeper, it's much more systemic, it's much more structural, and it's much more harder to solve than banning an app. So, I mean, that's about it.
Thank you, Devdatta. That was very well answered.
One thing that I would like to add, because she mentioned Section 144 orders. So I don't know if you guys read about it, but this happened in Mumbai as well, wherein to curb the spread of misinformation related to coronavirus, what they did was the Mumbai police passed the order under Section 144, wherein they said that the WhatsApp admins would be held liable for what the people in that group are saying, and the WhatsApp admins also have a legal responsibility to go and report this to the police. Now this creates like Devdatta said, this is not the answer to the problem. The problem is that there is a gap, there is a vacuum wherein disinformation is proliferating, and to solve that the government has a liability to create a channel wherein they are sending out information that is correct. The answer is not to impose legal penalties like Section 144 to curb this. So this is what I wanted to say. And I agree with Dev and what Apar said, that banning does not solve anything. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Well, we still do have few other questions, but looking at the time, I think it will be possibly great if we could take those questions maybe in another session, hopefully, which we can have with you all. And I think now it will be better if we conclude the session. Or if any one of you would still like to take some more questions, we have plenty of them.
What I would urge people to do instead is pose these questions, and I think my team will kill me for this because we hear it often enough, is to go to the Internet Freedom Forum where all of them also post their responses. Just look at their faces, please, not at mine. Okay. So, yeah, that's the kind of look that I get. I think Dr. Manish faces a similar predicament each time he also asks his colleagues to do something. Okay. And asks students, but that's the look which you get. Okay, it's called forum.internetfreedom.in. It's actually a very good place because it's a growing community of people who are actually building technology products. IFF is not only composed of lawyers. There are a lot of people who come from the technology sector, true technologists who are building these kind of products. And you can have really detailed and deep conversations with them. Okay, so I do look forward to these questions being posted on the forum. Go there, sign up, interact with us, and more, you'll get to learn about digital rights, and also you will have opportunities to volunteer, work, and just grow the field in a much better way. You will see that the conversations there are just not about the law. They're about understanding what goes into the making of the law. And today, what goes into the making of the law is understanding how do things work. You need to actually be mechanics at a very broad level to understand how certain technology systems building out. So thank you so much for your time. I would like to thank my colleagues Anushka and Devdatta to also, accommodating and providing their time on a Saturday. And I hope we've provided value to even the attendees who've come here on a Saturday evening, given that they would have had so many other webinars, if not other things to do. Thank you so much.
With this, I think we have come to the end of the session. I would like to thank Chief Patron, Program Director, and Program Coordinator for organizing today's event. Shivani and Farkhanda Zahoor they are from IFF. They have also been actively involved in organizing this event. Thanks to them as well. A mention should also be made for Mr. Abhinav Sharma. He's from RM and NLU for looking after all the logistics and technical front for a smooth webinar. And lastly, a special mention for Mr. Sanjay Divakar, his Joint Registrar, RML NLU. He's been really instrumental in organizing these events. So thanks to him as well. And obviously, lastly, to the panelists all here for such an enriching session. It has been really interactive, and we really look forward for many more such sessions with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, attendees, for attending this. Thanks, Akka.